The clay feels cold in the scholar's hands. Not museum display cold, but basement vault cold. The kind that seeps through cotton gloves and settles in finger bones. British Museum Storage Facility, 1920s. Catalogue number BM 78941. 8 inches of baked earth, covered in wedge-shaped impressions that no one has read in 4,000 years. The tablet isn't whole. The upper right corner is missing. Chips and cracks run through the surface like fault lines on a map of forgotten catastrophes. But enough remains. Enough cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay by a Babylonian scribe during the Kassite period, around 1646 BCE, to reveal something that would make every scholar who translated it pause. Because this tablet doesn't describe humanity's first mistake as eating forbidden fruit. It doesn't speak of towers reaching heaven or stolen fire from the gods. The transgression recorded here is simpler, more disturbing in its simplicity. According to the text inscribed on BM 78941 and its companion fragments, humanity's original mistake was this: we multiplied, we filled cities, we made noise, we thrived, and in thriving, we disturbed the sleep of the gods. That was the crime that triggered everything that followed. If you're listening to this at night, wherever you are in the world, perhaps you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something appropriate about exploring these ancient records in darkness, in the quiet hours, when noise itself seems like transgression. The tablet in the scholar's hands is part of a text called the Atra-Hasis epic. The name means exceedingly wise, referring to the human protagonist. But wisdom, as the text makes clear, did not protect humanity from the consequences of its fundamental mistake. The tablet describes creation not as blessing, but as solution to a labour problem. It documents divine frustration with the creatures they made. It records 3 systematic attempts to reduce human population before the final solution, the flood. But most disturbing of all, it explains why these attempts were necessary. The gods, the text states, could not sleep. The tumult of humanity, the noise of our cities, the clamour of our existence had become unbearable. And so the gods decided that humanity must be made quieter, smaller, less. This is not mythology, not in the dismissive sense. These are administrative records from the Sumerian perspective, documentation of policy decisions made regarding a population problem. The language is bureaucratic in places, almost clinical in its description of plague deployment and drought implementation. The scholar reading BM 78941 for the first time understood that something in the translation was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of mistranslated, wrong in the sense of unexpected, disturbing. Because if this tablet was correct, if its record aligned with dozens of other Sumerian and Akkadian texts making similar claims, then humanity's foundational mistake, according to the oldest civilization in history, was not moral failure. It was biological success. Let's begin with the clay itself, with the cities where these tablets were written, with the scribes who pressed wedges into wet earth to preserve a memory they believed future generations needed to understand. Let's trace the evidence from cuneiform to cuneiform, from excavation to translation, following the pattern that emerges when you arrange the tablets in sequence and read what they actually say about humanity's place in the cosmic order. This is not a story with a comfortable conclusion, but it is a story that has been waiting in museum basements and university archives for someone to assemble the pieces and ask the obvious question. What if the gods weren't punishing humanity for doing something wrong? What if they were punishing humanity for doing exactly what we were designed to do, but doing it too well? Before the noise, creation as convenience. To understand the mistake, we must first understand the creation, not the sanitized version, not the philosophical interpretation, the actual text as it appears on tablets excavated from Nippur, from Babylon, from the ruins of cities whose names we remember because they wrote them in clay and fired them hard enough to survive millennia. The Atra-Hasis epic begins with a situation, not a cosmic mystery or a divine plan, but a practical problem requiring solution. The tablets state it plainly: when the gods instead of man did the work, bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. This is the opening premise. The gods were labourers. They dug riverbed channels for the Tigris and Euphrates, they built irrigation networks, they worked the fields that would eventually support Sumerian civilization. And the younger gods, the ones assigned to this labour, finally rebelled against the older gods who commanded it. The Atra-Hasis text documents this rebellion in detail. The younger gods burned their tools. They marched at night to the house of Enlil, the king of the gods. They surrounded his dwelling. The text describes divine panic, Enlil's messenger racing to wake the king, the confrontation that followed when Enlil emerged to find his workers in revolt. Every one of us gods has declared war, they told him. The excessive labour has killed us. Our work was heavy, the distress much. Here is where the text becomes fascinating in its bureaucratic tone. Enlil didn't smite the rebels. He called a council. The divine assembly convened to address the labour crisis, and one god proposed a solution that would change everything. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, suggested creating something new. Not another god, but a creature intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, yet subordinate enough to accept orders. A being that could take over the work the gods no longer wished to do. The text uses the word Lulu, primitive man, a creature to bear the divine burden. But creating this being required sacrifice. A god had to die to provide the necessary components. The tablet names him Wi'ilu, also called Geshtui, a god who has sense. The text describes him as intelligent, wise, possessing understanding. These qualities were necessary for what came next. Wi'ilu offered himself. The gods slaughtered him. And the goddess Nintu, the mother goddess, also known as Ninhursag, took his flesh, his blood, his intelligence, and mixed them with clay. The text specifies his flesh and his blood let Ninti mix with clay. 7 males and 7 females were shaped from this mixture. The text describes the creation process as methodical, almost procedural. The gods spat on the clay. Nintu pinched off 14 pieces. Divine birth goddesses were summoned. The text details the gestation, the birth cries, the emergence of the first human beings. This is not Genesis, where God breathes life into dust and creates something in his image, blessed and beloved. This is a Mesopotamian solution to a labour shortage. Humans were made to work, to serve, to bear burdens the gods found too heavy. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets and discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, confirms this purpose in its 6th tablet. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her corpse, he addresses the divine assembly with a proposal regarding humanity. Blood I will mass and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Verily, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. That phrase, that they might be at ease, appears repeatedly in these creation texts. Humanity's purpose was not fellowship with divinity, not moral development, not spiritual evolution. The purpose was service, so the gods could rest. A related text, Enki and Ninmah, found on Old Babylonian tablets dating to around 1900 BC, describes the creation process in even more detail. This text takes the form of a contest between Enki and the goddess Ninmah, who becomes drunk at a feast celebrating humanity's creation, and begins making flawed humans, a blind man, a paralysed man, a man with uncontrollable urination, a barren woman. Enki, undisturbed, assigns each of these failed creations a role and occupation within human society. The text reveals something crucial. Even the imperfect humans had utility. Everyone could contribute labour in some form. This was not creation as gift, it was creation as manufacture. And like any manufactured object, humans had a function. The texts never waver on this point. Dozens of Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian tablets describing human origins all circle back to the same fundamental premise. We were made to work so the gods wouldn't have to. But here is where the pattern begins, because every one of these creation texts describes the same sequence of events. The gods create humans, the humans work, the gods are pleased for a time, and then, invariably, the texts describe what happened next. The humans multiplied, they built cities, they grew numerous, and crucially, they grew loud. The Atra-Hasis epic states 1200 years had not yet passed, the land extended, the peoples multiplied, the land was bellowing like a bull, that word bellowing. In the Akkadian it's rigmu, which can mean outcry, noise, clamour, tumult. The Sumerian equivalent is huba. Neither word implies organised rebellion or moral transgression. They describe the ambient noise of civilization, markets, festivals, construction, the acoustic signature of human life at scale. The text continues, the god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too much for me. I lose sleep because of their uproar. Read that again. The king of the gods lost sleep because humanity was too loud. This is the first indication that something has gone wrong, not from humanity's perspective. We were doing exactly what we were made to do, working, building, reproducing, filling the earth with cities and agriculture and the sounds of civilization. We were succeeding at our assigned function. But success, it seems, had acoustic consequences the gods had not anticipated. The texts suggest this was a design flaw. In creating beings intelligent enough to work effectively, the gods had also created beings capable of building cities, developing culture, expanding population, and all of this generated noise. The tablets describe Enlil's reaction as visceral. He was disturbed. He couldn't sleep. The tumult of humanity had become intolerable, and when a king cannot sleep, when a god is disturbed in his rest, something must be done to restore quiet. The Atra-Hasis epic is explicit about what happened next. Enlil convened the divine council and proposed a solution. Let us impose on them the burden of the death god. This marks the beginning of systematic population reduction, not yet the flood. That would come later, after other methods were tried and failed. But here, in the early sections of the Atra-Hasis text, we see the first divine intervention designed to make humanity quieter by making humanity fewer. The texts preserve these interventions in careful detail. They were not random catastrophes, they were policy implementations, and each one followed the same pattern. Enlil proposed it, the gods approved it, it was deployed against humanity, it initially worked, and then Enki undermined it by warning humanity how to survive. This dynamic, Enlil seeking to reduce human numbers, Enki subverting those efforts, runs through all of these texts. It suggests deep disagreement among the gods about the human question. Enlil viewed us as a noise problem requiring management. Enki, our creator, seemed to feel some obligation to preserve his creations, even when they disturbed divine sleep. But there was one moment when Enki's protection went only so far, one opportunity when humanity could have transcended its fundamental limitation, when mortality itself could have been undone. And in that moment, according to tablets housed in multiple museums and archaeological collections, Enki made a choice that sealed humanity's fate. The myth of Adapa, preserved on fragments discovered in the Egyptian city of El Amarna and in the Assyrian Royal Library, describes what happened when a human came close to immortality. The text calls him Adapa. He was king of Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition. Enki had made him exceptionally wise, granting him intelligence and knowledge that elevated him above ordinary humans. But Enki did not grant him eternal life. The text is clear on this deliberate limitation. He granted him wisdom, but he did not grant him eternal life. The question these creation texts raise is uncomfortable. If humanity was made to work, why did the gods care if we were numerous? More workers should have meant less individual burden. A larger population should have been beneficial from the perspective of maximising labour output. The answer lies in that word, noise. The tablets don't describe humans shirking duty or refusing to serve. They describe humans creating the acoustic environment of civilization, and that environment apparently was incompatible with divine rest. This suggests the mistake was built into the design. In making us intelligent enough to farm and build and organise complex societies, the gods made us capable of creating civilization. And civilization by its nature is loud. We were created to solve a problem, but in solving that problem we became one. The architecture of divine displeasure. The word appears again and again in the cuneiform, hubur, rigmu, as, allu. Each carries a shade of meaning, but all circle the same concept: noise, uproar, tumult, disturbance. The scribes chose these words carefully. They weren't describing a specific sound. They were describing an acoustic condition. To understand why this mattered so deeply to the gods, we must understand what noise meant in the Mesopotamian cosmic framework. This requires examining not just the Atra-Hasis epic, but the broader corpus of cuneiform texts that describe divine-human interaction, the nature of sacred space, and the maintenance of cosmic order. In Sumerian theology, the universe functioned according to me, a concept difficult to translate into English, but approximately meaning divine powers, cosmic principles, or fundamental attributes of civilization. These me were not abstract. They were tangible properties that could be stolen, transferred, or lost. The goddess Inanna famously stole over 60 me from Enki while he was drunk, transferring them from Eridu to her city Uruk. The text lists these me: kingship, priesthood, sexual relations, justice, music, warfare, craftsmanship. The proper functioning of reality depended on these me operating in harmony. Each god controlled certain me. Each city embodied specific combinations of me. And crucially, the cosmos was understood as balanced only when each component remained in its proper place, performing its proper function at proper volume. Silence was not valued universally. Temple ceremonies involved music, chanting, the ringing of bells and cymbals. Festivals were loud by design. What disturbed the gods, the texts suggest, was not noise itself, but rather unauthorized noise. Noise without ritual context. The ambient cacophony of human life conducted outside the framework of divine supervision. When the Atra-Hasis text describes humanity's noise as bellowing, it uses language elsewhere applied to chaos. The primordial goddess Tiamat in the Enuma Elish bellows before battle. The floodwaters, in multiple deluge narratives, roar like bulls. This linguistic choice associates human civilization noise with fundamental disorder. The Sumerian word huber is particularly revealing. In some contexts, it refers to the underworld river that separates the living from the dead. In others, it describes the noise of battle or the tumult of chaotic waters. When applied to humanity in the Atra-Hasis epic, Huber suggests our cities had become acoustic analogues to underworld chaos. This was not mere annoyance. In Mesopotamian thought, the boundaries between order and chaos required constant maintenance. The gods fought continually to prevent reality from sliding back into the primordial disorder that existed before creation. Marduk slew Tiamat to create ordered cosmos from her chaotic body. Enlil separated heaven and earth to prevent them from collapsing back together. The sun god Shamash travelled through the underworld each night, maintaining the cycle that prevented eternal darkness. Human noise, then, represented a return toward chaos within the ordered world. Not because we were rebelling, but because the very success of civilization generated acoustic conditions that resembled pre-creation tumult. Our cities roared. Our populations created hubbub through their sheer existence. A text fragment from Nippur, part of a larger composition sometimes called the Sumerian flood story or the Eridu Genesis, includes a remarkable line that didn't survive into the Atra-Hasis versions. Before describing the flood, the damaged tablet says something about humanity not keeping silent at the time of sleep. This phrase appears to be technical. The Sumerians divided time carefully. There were periods appropriate for different activities. Nighttime, when gods rested, was meant to be quiet. The text suggests humans violated this temporal boundary, not through any single action, but through the ambient noise of cities that functioned at all hours. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Excavations at Uruk, Nippur, and other Sumerian cities reveal densely packed housing, narrow streets, intensive craft production, brewing facilities, markets. These were not quiet settlements. They were urban centres with all the acoustic intensity urban life entails. Smiths hammered bronze, potters fired kilns, merchants called out prices, children played, animals moved through streets, festivals drew crowds. The acoustic environment of a Sumerian city would have been overwhelming to anyone accustomed to silence. Now consider the temples. Ziggurats rose above the cities, their upper levels housing the gods' residence. The Sumerian word for these sacred chambers was Giparu or Gipar, the place of rest. Not rest in the sense of casual relaxation, but cosmic rest, the maintenance of divine presence within ordered reality. The temples functioned as acoustic buffers, their massive mud brick walls dampening city noise, their elevated positions providing distance from the streets below. But as cities grew, as populations expanded, even temple walls couldn't contain the tumult. The text described divine irritation as physical. Enlil hears the noise, it disturbs his sleep. The language suggests bodily discomfort, almost pain, as if the noise of humanity had become a physical assault on divine senses. This frames the situation differently than familiar religious narratives. The gods weren't angry at human sin, they were exhausted by human success. We had fulfilled our function too thoroughly. We had multiplied as created beings do. We had built civilization as intelligent beings must. And in doing so, we had made the world unbearably loud for creatures who required quiet to maintain cosmic order. The Atra-Hasis epic specifies that 1200 years passed before the noise became intolerable. This number should not be taken literally. Mesopotamian mathematics used highly symbolic numerical systems, but it indicates a substantial period, long enough for humanity to forget its original purpose, long enough for population to expand beyond initial design parameters, long enough for cities to transform from settlements to civilizational centres. And then Enlil spoke the line that changes everything: "The noise of mankind has become too much for me. I lose sleep because of their uproar. The God-King who separated heaven and earth, who maintained cosmic order, who regulated the fates of all beings, this God could not sleep because of human noise." The texts present this as crisis, not moral crisis, but operational crisis, a fundamental system failure requiring immediate intervention. What follows is systematic, measured, almost clinical in its documentation. The tablets describe not divine rage, but divine problem-solving. Humanity had become too numerous, too successful, too loud. The solution, therefore, was to make humanity fewer, less successful, quieter. The method chosen was neither instant nor painless. The text described 3 separate interventions before the flood. Each one targeted human population. Each one was designed to restore acoustic balance by reducing the number of voices. And each one reveals something disturbing about how the gods viewed the beings they had created. Because these interventions weren't battles. They weren't even punishments in the traditional sense. They were culling operations, population management strategies implemented against a species that had exceeded its optimal numbers. The first intervention came quickly after Enlil's complaint. The tablets describe the divine council meeting, Enlil's proposal, the gods' agreement, and then comes a phrase that appears in multiple versions of the text, a phrase so specific It suggests technical implementation. Let the death God work his devastation. Not random death, managed death. The deployment of divine force specifically calibrated to reduce population without destroying humanity entirely. This was reduction, not extinction. The goal was return to acceptable numbers, restoration of cosmic quiet. The text doesn't specify exactly what the death god's devastation meant in practical terms. Was it plague, natural disaster, increased mortality rates? The tablets damaged at this section leave us with fragmentary phrases: disease, suffering, bodies in streets, a land made silent through loss. What the tablets do preserve is the result. Humanity's numbers decreased. The noise level dropped. The land grew quieter. And the gods, presumably, returned to their rest, but only temporarily, because the intervention had addressed symptoms, not cause. The surviving humans still possessed intelligence. They still reproduced. They still built cities. And within a period measured in the tablets as generations, the pattern repeated. Population grew, cities expanded, noise increased, and Enlil, once again disturbed from his rest, called another divine council. This is the pattern that dominates the Atra-Hasis text. Not a single catastrophic event, but a cycle: growth, noise, intervention, reduction, temporary quiet, then growth again. It suggests the gods were treating humanity as a recurring problem rather than a solvable one. Each intervention bought time. None addressed the fundamental issue. That issue being, we were designed to work, but not designed to remain few. Intelligence implies adaptation. Adaptation implies survival. Survival, in any species, implies reproduction. The gods had created beings programmed to do exactly what was now disturbing them. The tablets document 3 such interventions before the final solution, and with each one, the texts reveal something about the god Enki that complicates the entire narrative. Because while Enlil proposed population reduction, while the divine council approved it, while the mechanisms of devastation were deployed against humanity, Enki systematically undermined every attempt. The text describes this with remarkable clarity. After each divine decision to reduce humanity, Enki found a way to warn the humans, not to prevent the intervention entirely, but to ensure some survived. The tablets show him instructing humans to make specific offerings to specific gods, to take specific actions that would mitigate the devastation without appearing to directly defy the divine council. Why would Enki do this? The texts offer no explicit explanation, but the pattern suggests divided loyalties. He had created humanity. The beings now disturbing divine sleep were his work, formed from his design, animated by divine intelligence he had provided. Perhaps he felt creator responsibility. Perhaps he viewed humanity's success as validation of his craftsmanship. Perhaps he simply disagreed with Enlil's solution. Or perhaps, and this is what the tablets seem to suggest without stating, Enki recognized that humanity's mistake was not actually humanity's fault. We were doing exactly what we were made to do. The problem was the design, not the behavior. This interpretation finds support in what happens next in the Atra-Hasis narrative. Because after 3 failed attempts to quiet humanity through population reduction, after Enki's repeated interventions preserved enough humans to repopulate and rebuild and grow loud again, Enlil proposed something different. Not reduction, extinction, the flood, the first genocide, drought, plague, famine. The tablets describe the sequence with documentary precision. 3 interventions, 3 methods, 3 failures, and between each attempt, enough time for humanity to recover, multiply, and generate the noise that disturbed divine sleep. The first intervention has already been mentioned. Let the death god work his devastation. The tablets preserve fragments describing this period. Disease swept through cities. The text uses language suggesting epidemic, bodies in streets, mass graves, populations decimated. Modern scholars reading these passages note the clinical accuracy of the descriptions. These were not vague mythological plagues. The texts document specific symptoms, patterns of spread, the breakdown of social order that follows epidemic disease. One fragment describes people lying in the streets like fish. Another mentions the death god's net, suggesting the disease moved through populations in sweep patterns rather than random occurrence. The language implies systematic implementation, not natural disaster. Archaeological evidence from Sumerian sites shows distinct periods of population decline in the 3rd millennium BCE. Excavation layers reveal sudden decreases in inhabited areas, abandonment of city sections, mass burial practices inconsistent with normal death rates. While it's impossible to correlate these precisely with the events described in the Atra-Hasis, the tablet's description of systematic population reduction finds circumstantial support in the physical record. But the texts are clear. This first intervention didn't achieve the desired result. Humanity recovered. The Atra-Hasis epic states it plainly: 600 years, less than 600 years, the land extended, the peoples multiplied, the noise returned, and with it Enlil's frustration. The second intervention involved drought. The tablets describe this in greater detail than the first devastation, perhaps because drought's effects unfold slowly enough to document. The Atra-Hasis text provides what amounts to a timeline. First, Enlil commanded that rain be withheld. The text specifies, "Let Adad withhold his rain, below let the river not rise, let the springs not bring up water from the depths." Adad was the storm god, controller of rain. The phrasing suggests direct divine management of the water cycle. The text describes the progression. The first year, fields yielded reduced harvests. The second year, the land became parched. By the third year, people's faces were changed by famine. The fourth and fifth years brought increasing desperation. By the sixth year, the tablets record cannibalism. When the sixth year arrived, they prepared the daughter for a meal. They prepared the child for food. This is documented horror, not symbolic, not metaphorical. The text describes societies collapsing under resource scarcity, parents eating children, cities emptying as people migrated seeking water, the land growing quiet, but only because the people were dying or gone. The language the tablets use for this period is specific. Utu, to dry up. Kru, famine. Imtu, death. These weren't general terms for hardship. They were technical vocabulary for specific conditions caused by systematic water deprivation. And again, the tablets record Enki's intervention. Unable to directly defy Enlil's drought order, Enki instead instructed humanity to cease worship of all gods except Adad, the storm god. Make offerings to him alone, Enki told the human leader in the text, as Atra-Hasis, the exceedingly wise one. Appeal specifically to the god whose function was being withheld. The strategy worked. Adad, flattered by exclusive worship and moved by human suffering, sent rain despite Enlil's command. The drought broke, crops grew, population recovered, the noise resumed. The third intervention was famine, but this time the mechanism was different. The Atra-Hasis tablets describe Enlil learning from previous failures. He realized that targeting single elements of human survival allowed Enki to subvert the intervention by manipulating the god controlling that element. So for the third attempt, Enlil created a coalition. The text describes him summoning multiple gods simultaneously. Let the oven not bring forth bread, let the field not yield increase, let vegetation be suppressed, let no grain sprout. This wasn't drought alone, but total agricultural failure. Multiple divine forces coordinated to prevent food production through any means. The tablets document this famine as worse than the drought. It lasted longer. The devastation was more complete. The descriptions are harrowing. The people's appearance was changed by hunger. Their faces were covered with crust like malt. One fragment preserves a remarkable detail. During this famine, the tablets state, the people's noise was stilled. The Akkadian verb is na, to be still, to fall silent. This suggests the intervention achieved its goal. Humanity grew quiet, not through willingness or compliance, but through starvation and death. The noise that disturbed Enlil ceased because the people making noise were dying. But even this coordinated famine could not completely succeed. The tablets preserve Enki's countermeasure. He instructed humans to fish the rivers and seas. While land-based agriculture failed, Enki ensured the waters remained productive. Fish populations exploded. Humanity survived on seafood, on creatures from Enki's domain of fresh and salt water. The text describes Enlil's reaction to this latest subversion. He confronted Enki directly. The people are not diminished. They are more numerous than before. The exclamation suggests genuine frustration. 3 interventions, 3 failures, and behind each failure, Enki's protection of the beings he had created. This confrontation marks a turning point in the text. Up to this moment, Enlil had attempted to reduce human population while maintaining the species' existence. Fewer humans meant less noise, but humans could still perform their original function of divine service. The interventions were culling operations, not extinction events. But after the 3rd failure, the tablets record Enlil proposing something different. He called a divine assembly, and his words shifted from management to elimination. The noise of mankind has become too much. Their noise disturbs my sleep. Cut off food supplies for the peoples. Let plant life be insufficient for their stomachs. Let Adad withhold his rain from above, and below let the springs not bring up water from the depths. Let the wind blow and dry up the ground. Let the clouds gather, but not release rain upon the earth. This was comprehensive, total. The text describes it as binding all gods to the effort. The gods agreed to the total destruction. Except they didn't call it destruction, they called it the flood, the Abu, the deluge that would wash away not just cities, not just populations, but all trace of human presence. A reset, a return to pre-human conditions when the gods alone inhabited the world. The tablets preserve the divine reasoning. I shall destroy my creations. People shall revert to clay. The phrase revert to clay is significant. It acknowledges what humanity was made from and suggests return to pre-creation state. Reverse the process. Unmake what was made. This was not correction, this was erasure. But there's something crucial to understand about these 3 failed interventions before the flood. Each one targeted humanity's basic survival needs: health, water, food. Each one was implemented through divine control of natural systems, and each one was calibrated to cause suffering and death without technically violating any cosmic law or divine agreement. This suggests the gods viewed humanity as their creation and therefore their property, subject to management as the creators saw fit. The tablets never present anyone questioning Enlil's right to reduce human population. The debates recorded in the divine assemblies concern method and extent, not fundamental authority. Humanity in these texts has no advocate except Enki, and Enki's advocacy is constrained by his position within the divine hierarchy. He cannot directly oppose Enlil, he cannot prevent the interventions, he can only mitigate them, subvert them, ensure some humans survive. This dynamic becomes crucial for understanding what happens next, because when Enlil proposed the flood, total destruction rather than population reduction, Enki faced a choice: oppose the divine council directly and risk his own status, or allow humanity to be destroyed entirely. The tablets record his decision. He chose protection, but in a way that technically didn't violate Enlil's command. The Atra-Hasis epic describes Enki approaching Atra-Hasis, the human king of the city of Shuruppak. But Enki doesn't speak to Atra-Hasis directly. Instead, he speaks to the reed walls of Atra-Hasis' house, knowing the man is inside listening reed wall. Atra-Hasis, pay attention to my advice, that you may live forever. Destroy your house, build a boat, spurn possessions, and save life. Draw out the boat, that you will build with a roof like the Apsu, so that the sun will not see inside it. Let it be roofed over, above and below. This is technicality. Enki warned the wall, not the man. He maintained deniability while ensuring the information reached human ears. The text presents this as a clever solution to an impossible situation: how to protect humanity without directly defying the Divine Council's extinction order. But notice what Enki doesn't do. He doesn't warn all of humanity. He doesn't provide time for evacuation or preparation on a civilizational scale. He warns one human, one family, enough to preserve the species, but not enough to prevent the catastrophe from achieving its essential goal, making humanity fewer and therefore quieter. The instructions Enki provides are specific. Build a boat, not a raft, but a proper vessel with roof and walls. Make it large enough for your family and representatives of the animals. Load seed grain. Bring craftsmen who can help rebuild civilization afterward. And most importantly, keep this secret. Tell no one until the boat is complete. The Atra-Hasis tablet describes Atra-Hasis following these instructions exactly. He built the boat in 7 days, working in secret, telling his neighbours he was building a large granary. The text records his neighbours helping, unknowingly constructing the vessel that would save one family while they themselves drowned. This detail is preserved in multiple flood narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet C, contains a parallel account where the hero at Napishtim receives similar warnings and builds a similar boat. The Eridugenesis on the fragment CBS 10673, housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the same pattern though with greater damage to the text. The consistency across sources suggests this was understood as established fact. One human was warned, built a boat, survived. 7 days of construction. Then the flood. The tablets describe the deluge with language that borders on trauma documentation. The storm comes at night. The text states, as soon as the first light of dawn appeared, a black cloud came up from the horizon. Adad was thundering inside it. The gods Shulat and Hanish were going in front, moving as heralds over hill and land. The rain begins. But not normal rain. The text specifies the Anunnaki lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze with their glare. The stillness of the storm, God passed over the sky, and all light was turned into darkness. This is not weather. This is weaponized water. The gods deployed the flood with intent and precision. The tablets record 6 days and 7 nights of continuous deluge. Water rose from below and above simultaneously. Springs opened, rivers swelled, rain pounded. The text describes people drowning in their homes, climbing to rooftops, clutching children as the water rose. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They shrank back, went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched outside. Even the gods who authorized the flood were horrified by its result. The tablets describe them weeping, regretting their decision, too late to reverse it. The mother goddess Nintu, who had helped create humanity, cried out like a woman in labour. The olden days have turned to clay. How could I order such evil in the assembly of gods? How could I order war to destroy my people? Her lament is preserved in multiple versions. She acknowledges complicity. She agreed to the flood. She now regrets it. But the water still rises. The people still drown. Remorse changes nothing. 7 days. Then silence. The flood waters calmed. The boat came to rest on a mountain peak. The text calls it Mount Nimush, unidentified in modern geography, but understood as somewhere in the Zagros mountain range. Atra-Hasis opened the hatch. The world was still, silent. The city's gone. The noise that had disturbed Enlil's sleep was finally, completely ended. Every human, except those in the boat, was dead. The mistake of multiplication, of thriving, of making noise, that mistake had been corrected. The earth was quiet again. But the text describes what happened next. Atra-Hasis emerged from the boat and made a sacrifice to the gods. He built an altar, slaughtered animals, burned offerings. The smell of the sacrifice rose to heaven, where the gods, still cowering from their own destruction, noticed it, and they realized something. They were hungry. Without humans to provide offerings, without priests to perform rituals, without civilization to generate worship, the gods had no food. They had destroyed their servants, and now discovered they needed those servants. The tablets describe the gods gathering around Atra-Hasis' sacrifice like flies. This comparison is deliberately undignified. The mighty gods who killed humanity now crowd around a single human's offering, desperate for sustenance. Enlil arrived and saw Atra-Hasis. The text records his fury. Where did a living being escape? No man was to survive the destruction. Enki defended himself. He admitted warning the wall. He argued that total human extinction was excessive, that some solution short of annihilation should have been attempted. And then Enki proposed something new, a different answer to the problem of human noise. Not extinction, not even population reduction through periodic catastrophe, but redesign, biological modification of humanity to prevent the population from ever again reaching noise-generating levels. The tablets preserve this proposal in detail, and what Enki suggested reveals just how far the gods were willing to go to ensure their own rest, the solution that became the problem. The divine council after the flood faced a paradox. Humanity had been eliminated, the noise was gone, the gods had quiet, but they also had hunger, no human prayers, no offerings, no worship. The system of divine sustenance through human service had collapsed. They needed humans, but they needed fewer, quieter humans than before. Enki's proposal appears in the final section of the Atra-Hasis epic, on tablets that are partially damaged, but whose core content survives across multiple copies. What he suggested was biological intervention, modification of human reproduction to prevent population from reaching pre-flood levels. The text is specific. In addition, let there be a third category among the peoples women who bear and women who do not bear. Let there be among the peoples the Basitu demon to snatch the baby from the lap of her who bore it. Establish high priestesses and priestesses. Let them be taboo, and so stop childbirth. This is systematic population control through three mechanisms. First, create biological variation in fertility, some women naturally unable to conceive. Second, increase infant mortality through demonic intervention, babies dying despite successful birth. Third, consecrate certain women to religious service requiring virginity, removing them from reproductive population. The text continues, when the people have become too many, let there be disease, famine, and let the death god constantly diminish the population. What Enlil wanted, population reduction, would be built into the human condition itself, not as punishment requiring divine intervention, but as permanent feature of mortal existence. Death would continuously trim humanity to sustainable numbers. Reproduction would be curtailed through multiple mechanisms, and even when population did grow, disease and famine would automatically restore balance. This was the bargain. Humanity could continue existing, but humanity would be redesigned to remain small, perpetually vulnerable, eternally unable to approach the noise, generating population levels that had previously disturbed divine rest. The tablets record that the divine assembly agreed to these terms, and Nintu, the mother goddess who had originally helped create humanity from clay and divine blood, accepted the task of implementing the modifications. This explains something profound about the human condition as the Sumerians understood it. Infertility was not random misfortune. Infant death was not tragic accident. These were designed features, deliberately built in limitations, preventing humanity from becoming too successful again. The implications are disturbing. Every woman who wanted children but couldn't conceive, every baby who died despite all care, every priestess who remained celibate, these were not divine tests of faith or mysterious workings of providence. They were population control mechanisms implemented after the flood to ensure humanity never again generated enough noise to disturb the gods. But there's something else preserved in these post-flood texts, an encounter that reveals just how completely the gods intended to limit humanity's potential, because in addition to reproductive constraints, they also needed to ensure humans remained mortal. That death itself, beyond infant mortality and disease, remained absolute. This is where the myth of Adapa becomes crucial. The tablets containing this myth were discovered in 2 separate locations, 3 fragments from the Egyptian city of Tel el-Amarna, part of the diplomatic archive of Pharaoh Akhenaten from around 1350 BCE, and additional copies from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The wide distribution suggests this story was understood as foundational across Mesopotamian culture. Adapa was king of Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. The text describes him as exceptionally wise because Enki, who created him, had granted him unusual intelligence. The first tablet states he possessed intelligence, his command like the command of Anu, he granted him a wide ear to reveal the destiny of the land, he granted him wisdom, but he did not grant him eternal life. That final phrase is critical. Enki deliberately withheld immortality while granting exceptional intelligence. The text doesn't explain why, but it establishes that Adapa was superior to other humans in every respect except one: he would die. The myth describes an incident. Adapa went fishing in the Persian Gulf. A storm arose. Specifically, the south wind capsized his boat. Furious, Adapa cursed the wind, "South wind, I shall break your wing." And somehow, perhaps through Enki's wisdom that Adapa possessed, the curse worked. The wing of the south wind was broken. For 7 days, no wind blew from the south. This caught the attention of Anu, the sky god, king of the gods above Enlil. Anu summoned Adapa to heaven to explain why a mortal had broken a wind that was necessary for cosmic functioning. Enki heard about the summons and spoke to Adapa, giving him advice for his journey to heaven. The text preserves Enki's words in detail. When you come up to heaven and approach the gate of Anu, Tammuz and Gishsida will be standing at the gate of Anu. When they see you, they will say, "Sir, for whose sake do you appear thus? For whom are you clad in a mourning garment?" Tell them, "In our country 2 gods have vanished, therefore I am thus." They will ask, "Who are the 2 gods who have vanished from the land?" Tell them, "Tammuz and Gishsida." They will look at one another and be astonished, and good words they will speak to Anu. This was flattery. Tammuz and Gishsida were dying and reviving gods associated with vegetation cycles. By claiming to mourn them as if they were dead, Adapa would indicate he remembered and honoured them. The text confirms this strategy worked. The guardians were pleased and spoke favourably of Adapa to Anu. But then Enki gave Adapa a warning. "When you stand before Anu, food of death they will set before you, eat not. Water of death they will set before you, drink not. Garments they will offer you, put them on. Oil they will offer you, anoint yourself. The advice I have given you, forget not." Adapa followed these instructions exactly. He went to heaven. He flattered Tammuz and Gishsida. He was brought before Anu. And when Anu heard Adapa's explanation for breaking the south wind, the sky god was impressed. The text describes Anu's response. "Why has Ea revealed to impure mankind the heart of heaven and earth? A heart has he created within him, has made him a name. What can we do with him?" This is the crucial moment. Anu recognized that Adapa's intelligence made him almost divine. The sky god faced the same question the divine council faced after creating humanity: what to do with beings who approach godlike capability. Anu's answer was unexpected. Food of life bring him, that he may eat. Not food of death, as Enki had warned, food of life. The text is explicit. Anu ordered that Adapa be given the food and water of eternal life. If Adapa consumed them, he would become immortal. But Adapa, following Enki's advice, refused. The text describes the scene. Food of life they brought him, but he ate not. Water of life they brought him, but he drank not. Garments they brought him, he clothed himself. Oil they brought him, he anointed himself. Anu watched this rejection with astonishment. "Come, Adapa, "Why have you not eaten, not drunk? Now you shall not live." Adapa answered, "Ere my lord said, Eat not, drink not." The tablets record Anu's response as anger directed at Enki, but the text is fragmentary at this point. What survives suggests Anu sent Adapa back to earth, mortal, denied the eternal life that had been within his grasp, and Anu summoned Enki to account for his deception. Multiple interpretations of this myth exist. Some scholars suggest Enki genuinely believed Anu would poison Adapa and tried to protect him. The text offers no support for this reading. Nowhere does it suggest Anu intended harm. Other scholars see this as Enki preventing humanity from becoming too powerful, maintaining divine superiority by ensuring even the wisest human remained mortal. The second interpretation aligns with the pattern established in the Atra-Hasis epic. Enki protected humanity from extinction, but he also maintained limits. He saved Atra-Hasis from the flood, but only Atra-Hasis, not all humanity. He granted Adapa exceptional wisdom, but not eternal life. And when Anu offered to correct that limitation, Enki intervened to prevent it. Why? The answer seems to be the same dynamic that drove the entire post-flood settlement. The gods needed humans, but they needed humans who remained inferior, controllable, incapable of disturbing divine rest. Mortality ensured humans remained temporary. Death guaranteed population turnover. Without death, even with reproductive constraints, human numbers would eventually accumulate to pre-flood levels. Adapa's mistake, trusting Enki, refusing the food and water of life, was humanity's mistake. The opportunity for eternal life was offered by the highest god and rejected by human obedience to a lower god's deception. The text presents this as definitive. That moment, that refusal, locked humanity into mortality permanently. There would be no second chance. No other human would be summoned to Anu's heaven and offered immortality. Adapa's failure became humanity's fate. The two myths, the Atra-Hasis flood narrative and the Adapa immortality tale, fit together into coherent framework. After the flood, the gods redesigned humanity with built-in population controls and maintained mortality. But they also had to ensure no human would accidentally stumble into immortality through exceptional achievement or divine favour. The Adapa myth served as cautionary tale and confirmation. Even the wisest human, even the one most favoured by the Creator God, could not escape mortality. Death was absolute, permanent. The boundary between human and divine would not be crossed. This framework explains another famous Mesopotamian text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Because Gilgamesh's entire quest, his desperate search for eternal life after witnessing his friend Enkidu's death, was doomed from the start. The text documenting Gilgamesh's failure reinforced the message of the Adapa myth. Mortality is not accident, it is design. And that design traces directly back to humanity's original mistake, thriving too successfully, becoming too numerous, making too much noise. But before we examine Gilgamesh's confirmation of this principle, we need to understand something else the tablets preserve. Because hidden within Sumerian records is a document that predates the flood, a text that was supposedly transmitted from before the catastrophe to after, carrying warnings from the pre-flood world to the survivors. This text is called the Instructions of Shuruppak, and what it reveals about how humans understood their own transgression before the gods destroyed them adds crucial context to everything that follows. Instructions from the edge of the flood. The text begins with literary framing that establishes its authority in those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those far away nights, in those years, in those far remote years. This is invocation of deep antiquity. The instructions of Shuruppak claim to preserve wisdom from before the flood, transmitted from father to son across the catastrophe, advice from someone who lived in the world that was destroyed and who wanted future generations to avoid repeating the mistakes that triggered destruction. The text is preserved in multiple copies from various periods, with the Old Babylonian version from Nippur providing the most complete text. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature has compiled these sources into composite edition, showing where different versions agree and where they vary. Shuruppak was, according to the Sumerian king list, the fifth and final city to hold kingship before the flood. The last king of Shuruppak was Ubaratutu, whose reign lasted 18,600 years in the king list's chronology. Shuruppak was Ubaratutu's son, and his son was Ziusudra, the flood hero. This makes the instructions a 3-generation transmission: grandfather king, father sage, son survivor. The text positions itself as literal last words from the world before catastrophe, advice for navigating the world that would come after. The opening establishes this framework. Shuruppak gave instructions to his son. Shuruppak, the son of Ubaratutu, gave instructions to his son Ziusudra. My son, let me give you instructions. You should pay attention. Ziusudra, let me speak a word to you. You should pay attention. Do not neglect my instructions. Do not transgress the words I speak. The instructions of an old man are precious. You should comply with them. Then follows the actual advice. And what's remarkable about this advice is how mundane it appears at first glance. Practical instructions about daily life, avoiding conflict, managing property, treating others fairly, nothing explicitly about not angering gods or avoiding cosmic catastrophe. But beneath the surface practicality runs consistent thread. Keep yourself small, avoid drawing attention, do not disturb others, maintain quiet. The text advises, you should not buy a donkey which brays, it will split your midriff. A donkey that brays is a noisy donkey. The instruction is to avoid acquiring animals that make disturbance. You should not locate a field on a road. You should not place your house next to a public square. There is always a crowd there. Avoid locations associated with traffic, with gatherings, with the ambient noise of human activity. You should not loiter about where there is a quarrel. You should not let the quarrel make you a witness. Conflict generates noise. Remove yourself from situations that create disturbance. You should not boast, then your words will be trusted. Boasting is verbal excess. It draws attention. It makes you loud. The alternative, quiet humility, generates trust. The text continues through dozens of specific instructions, but the pattern remains consistent. Restrain yourself. Limit your visibility. Avoid situations that generate noise or conflict. These are not random moral precepts. They are systematic instructions for living quietly in a world where excessive human presence had already triggered divine response. The instructions also warn against excess more generally. You should not scatter your sheep into unknown pastures. Don't expand beyond what you can manage. Don't overextend. You should not travel during the night. It can hide both good and evil. Don't push boundaries. Stay within safe, visible, regulated patterns. You should not make a young man best man. Don't elevate the young too quickly. Maintain established hierarchy. Change slowly. These instructions function as population control advice. If followed, they would keep humanity distributed across small, manageable settlements rather than concentrated in large, noisy cities. They would prevent rapid growth. They would maintain stability through social conservatism. The text also includes a remarkable section on avoiding certain types of people or relationships that would generate complications. You should not buy a prostitute. She is a mouth that bites. You should not buy a house-born slave. He is a herb that makes the stomach sick. You should not buy a free man. He will always lean against the wall. You should not buy a palace slave girl. She will always be the bottom of the barrel. These warnings suggest avoiding relationships with people from different social categories. Keep to your level. Don't complicate your life with complex social negotiations. Maintain simplicity. The underlying message: complexity generates problems. Problems generate conflict. Conflict generates noise. Avoid the entire chain by maintaining simple, quiet existence. One instruction is particularly revealing. My son, you should not commit robbery. You should not cut yourself with an axe. The pairing is strange. Why connect robbery with self-harm? The text suggests that transgression brings inevitable consequence. To steal is to cut yourself. The damage returns to the actor. This reflects broader principle in Mesopotamian theology. Actions have consequences that loop back to their origin, make noise, disturb divine rest, face population reduction. The pattern is automatic, not arbitrary. The instructions also warn specifically about speech. You should not speak improperly. Later it will lay a trap for you. Words create effects. Improper speech, loud speech, boastful speech, careless speech generates consequences that trap the speaker. The solution is careful verbal restraint. Tell a lie and then tell the truth, it will be considered a lie. Once you establish reputation for unreliability, even truth becomes suspect. Better to maintain reputation for quiet honesty than to risk losing credibility through any excess. The text returns repeatedly to the theme of listening and obedience. The artistic mouth recites words, the harsh mouth brings litigation documents, the sweet mouth gathers sweet herbs. Quality of speech determines quality of outcome. Harsh speech generates legal problems. Sweet speech generates benefits. Choose carefully how you sound. This matters in context of the noise problem. Human speech was part of the hubris that disturbed divine rest. Markets, arguments, festivals, negotiations, all generated linguistic noise. The instructions advise minimizing verbal impact through careful, measured speech. One section addresses relationships with the powerful. You should submit to the respected. You should be humble before the powerful. My son, you will then survive against the wicked. Submission and humility are survival strategies. Don't challenge hierarchy. Don't disturb established order. Make yourself small before those above you. This advice serves dual function. It maintains social stability, preventing conflict that would generate noise, and it positions the individual as non-threatening, unlikely to draw punitive attention from either human or divine powers. The instructions also contain warnings about excess consumption. A drunkard will drown the harvest. Intoxication leads to waste. Maintain sobriety, control yourself. You should not pass judgment when you drink beer. Impairment compromises decision-making. Major choices require clear mind. Don't let altered states disrupt proper functioning. And remarkably, advice about family structure. The elder brother is indeed like a father. The elder sister is indeed like a mother. Listen therefore to your elder brother, and you should be obedient to your elder sister as if she were your mother. Maintain hierarchy within family. Respect age order. Don't disrupt generational structure. These instructions preserve stability by preventing family conflict, which would generate the kind of domestic noise that, multiplied across thousands of households, becomes city-wide disturbance. The text concludes with summary statement emphasizing the value of these instructions. Shuruppak gave these instructions to his son. Shuruppak, the son of Ubaratutu, gave these instructions to his son Ziusudra. And then comes a line that frames the entire document. Praise be to the lady who completed the great tablets, the maiden Nisaba, that Shuruppak, the son of Ubaratutu, gave his instructions. Nisaba was the Sumerian goddess of writing, grain and wisdom. Her invocation at the text's end suggests these instructions were understood as divinely significant, worth preserving in permanent written form. But here's what makes the instructions of Shuruppak extraordinary in the context of humanity's first mistake. These instructions were given before the flood, yet they survived the flood to be copied repeatedly in the post-flood world. How? The text itself provides the answer. Ziusudra, the recipient of these instructions, was the flood survivor. He carried his father's advice into the post-flood world, and those instructions, focused on restraint and quietness, became template for how post-flood humanity should behave to avoid triggering another catastrophe. The instructions function as preventative wisdom. They don't describe what happened. That's the role of the Atra-Hasis epic and similar narratives. Instead, they prescribe how to live so it doesn't happen again. Every instruction about avoiding noise, controlling speech, limiting expansion, maintaining humility. These are specific countermeasures to the behaviours that triggered the flood. Humanity made noise. The gods destroyed humanity. The instructions teach, don't make noise. This is why the text was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years after it was first composed. Students learning cuneiform copied these instructions as part of their education. Multiple versions exist from different periods and locations. The wisdom of Shuruppak became foundational to Mesopotamian understanding of proper human behaviour. The text shaped a culture of restraint, of knowing your place, of understanding that human success could become human danger if it crossed invisible thresholds. The gods destroyed the world once, they could do it again. The only protection was careful self-limitation. This anxiety permeates Sumerian and Babylonian literature. The instructions of Shuruppak made it explicit, but other texts reinforce the same message through different narratives. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, ends with the hero accepting mortality and taking pride in city walls he built. Building is acceptable, cities are acceptable, but the implicit understanding is that these must be maintained at acceptable scale, generating acceptable noise levels. Gilgamesh's Uruk was great city, but not so great it disturbed divine rest. The Adapa myth showed that even exceptional humans must remain mortal. Immortality would allow indefinite accumulation of human presence. Death ensures turnover, prevents excessive population density. The flood narratives documented what happened when humans exceeded limits. The king list marked the boundary between ages of excess and ages of caution, and the instructions of Shuruppak provided practical manual for living carefully in a world where divine patience had been tested once and found finite. Together, these texts create coherent theological framework. Humans were created to serve. We served too successfully. We multiplied, built cities, made noise. The gods responded with population reduction attempts, then finally with the flood. Survivors were redesigned with biological limitations and given cultural instructions for restraint. The instructions are those cultural instructions, preserved from before the catastrophe, transmitted across it, maintained afterward as essential wisdom for post-flood existence. But one question remained for anyone reading these texts carefully. If the instructions were given before the flood, if Shuruppak knew disaster was coming, why didn't he warn more people? Why did only Ziusudra build a boat? The texts never answer this directly, but the implication is devastating. Perhaps Shuruppak, like the gods themselves, believed most of humanity needed to be destroyed. Perhaps his instructions to Ziusudra were not just general wisdom, but specific survival advice for the catastrophe he knew was imminent. Perhaps the instructions were never meant for everyone. They were elite knowledge, transmitted from father to son, meant to preserve one family line through the coming destruction while the rest of humanity perished. This would make the instructions not compassionate advice for all people, but exclusive wisdom for the chosen few. A father protecting his son while accepting that everyone else would drown. The text doesn't confirm this reading, but it doesn't deny it either, and that ambiguity reveals something crucial about how these texts understood divine-human relationships. The gods didn't owe humanity survival. They didn't owe warning or explanation. Humanity existed for divine convenience. When that existence became inconvenient, elimination was justified. The only hope was individual relationship with sympathetic God, Enki in this case, who might provide warning to a specific person without preventing general catastrophe. Ziusudra survived not because he deserved it more than others, not because he was more moral or more obedient, but because his father was wise enough to earn Enki's favour, and his grandfather was king of the last pre-flood city, and his family line was worth preserving. Everyone else drowned. The instructions of Shuruppak, read this way, are survival manual for an elect. They teach how to avoid divine notice, how to remain beneath threshold where divine patience runs out. They preserve wisdom about living carefully in dangerous cosmos where gods maintain order and humans are tolerated only so long as they don't disturb that order. And the central instruction, repeated in various forms throughout the text, is simple: be quiet, stay small, don't draw attention, your survival depends on your insignificance. This was humanity's lesson from its first mistake. We had been loud, we had been numerous, we had drawn attention, and we had nearly been erased for it. The instructions taught future generations never again. The bargain, infertility, infant death, and sacred virgins. The final section of the Atra-Hasis epic contains language that is clinically precise in ways that suggest the scribes who recorded it were documenting policy decisions rather than mythological events. The tablet describes the post-flood settlement, the terms under which humanity would be allowed to continue existing. The text states, in addition, let there be a third category among the peoples women who bear and women who do not bear. This is specification of biological variation. Not all women would be capable of reproduction. Some would be naturally infertile, unable to conceive regardless of attempt. This wasn't presented as defect or curse. It was deliberate design feature built into post-flood humanity to limit population growth. The text continues, let there be among the peoples the Perpetually demon to snatch the baby from the lap of her who bore it. Perpetually, also known as Lamashtu, was understood in Mesopotamian religion as female demon who killed infants and caused miscarriages. The text explicitly states this entity was created as population control mechanism. Successful conception and pregnancy did not guarantee successful birth or survival. The demon would snatch babies, ensuring infant mortality remained high enough to prevent population from exceeding acceptable levels. Numerous Sumerian and Akkadian incantation texts exist attempting to ward off Perpetually, clay plaques depicting demon being driven away, amulets worn by pregnant women, rituals performed to protect newborns. These weren't superstitious practices developed randomly. They were responses to theological understanding that infant death was divine policy, not tragic accident. If babies died because demons snatched them, and demons were created by gods to control population, then protecting your baby meant interfering with divine will. This created impossible situation for parents. You wanted your child to survive, but child's death served cosmic function. Fighting to save your baby potentially contributed to the very population excess that had triggered the flood. The texts don't resolve this tension, they preserve it. Parents used every available method to protect children. Gods maintained mechanisms that killed those children. The cycle continued, generating the desired result, population growth limited by high infant mortality. The Atra-Hasis epic specifies a third mechanism: establish high priestesses and priestesses, let them be taboo, and so stop childbirth. This refers to religious offices requiring virginity or celibacy. Women consecrated to temple service, particularly in roles as Enki priestesses or Naditu women, were prohibited from sexual activity and therefore from reproduction. These weren't voluntary individual choices. These were institutional positions established by divine command that removed significant numbers of women from reproductive population. The text frames this as taboo, a technical term indicating prohibition backed by religious and cosmic authority. To violate taboo was to risk divine punishment and cosmic disruption. Women in these positions could not marry or bear children without fundamental transgression of cosmic order. Historical records confirm these institutions existed. Temple archives from Uruk, Sippar, and other cities document priestesses and Naditu women. Some came from wealthy families who paid substantial sums for positions. Others were selected through ritual procedures, but all shared the same requirement: celibacy. This meant that a significant portion of women, probably between 5 and 15% depending on city and period, were systematically removed from reproductive population. Combined with natural infertility and high infant mortality, This created powerful population break. But the text doesn't stop with reproductive limitations. It continues, when the people have become too many, let there be disease, famine, and let the death god constantly diminish the population. This is permanent implementation of the interventions attempted before the flood. Disease, famine, death. These would no longer be exceptional measures deployed when population exceeded thresholds. They would be continuous background conditions, always active, always reducing numbers. The phrase constantly diminish is significant. The Akkadian verb suggests ongoing action, not periodic intervention. Death would actively work against population growth every single day. The balance would be maintained automatically through high baseline mortality. This explains something about Mesopotamian life that archaeological evidence confirms. People died young and frequently. Life expectancy in Sumerian cities was probably between 30 and 40 years. Infant mortality may have exceeded 50%. Skeletal remains show evidence of malnutrition, disease, violent death. These weren't unfortunate circumstances. According to the Atra-Hasis, they were design features. The gods had engineered post-flood humanity to suffer high mortality rates as automatic population regulator. The text describes Enlil's satisfaction with this arrangement. The noise problem would not recur. Humans could rebuild civilization, cities, agriculture, but they would never again reach population densities that generated pre-flood noise levels. Death and infertility would prevent it. And crucially, this arrangement meant the gods wouldn't need to intervene directly. The flood had been exhausting even for the gods who authorized it. The text described them regretting it, being horrified by the result, weeping at the devastation. Enlil didn't want to repeat that experience. He wanted an automatic system that maintained balance without requiring his attention. The post-flood biological modifications provided that system. Humans would police their own numbers through built-in limitations. The gods could return to their rest, confident that noise would never again reach intolerable levels. But there's a phrase in the Atra-Hasis epic that suggests one more element of divine control. Let disease, plague, and death god constantly diminish the population. The list includes disease and plague as separate categories. Disease was chronic conditions, ongoing illness that weakened and killed. Plague was epidemic outbreak, sudden mortality spikes affecting large populations. The text implies these were not just natural phenomena, but managed forces. The gods controlled disease deployment. They could increase or decrease plague frequency. They maintained active oversight of human mortality, adjusting death rates as needed to keep population within acceptable range. This creates theological framework where every illness, every epidemic, every premature death served divine purpose. Your child died of fever? That was death god doing his assigned work. Your wife died in childbirth? That was design feature preventing population excess. You contracted chronic illness that limited your lifespan? That was divine population management in action. This is not comforting theology. It's brutal pragmatism. The gods needed humans for worship and service, but only in controlled numbers. Everything that limited human life and reproduction was therefore functional, necessary, part of cosmic order. The text preserved one more detail about post-flood arrangements. After describing the biological modifications, the Atra-Hasis epic describes Nintu, the mother goddess, weeping. She had helped create humanity originally. Now she accepted humanity's redesign to include suffering and death. The text records her lament. My offspring, I have become a stranger to them. The noise of mankind has been silenced. Their clamour is no more. This is ambiguous line. Is she mourning humanity's reduction or celebrating the end of noise? The text doesn't clarify. Both interpretations fit. But the phrase I have become a stranger to them suggests disconnection. The mother goddess no longer recognises her creations. Post-flood humanity is different from what she originally made. The modifications have alienated creator from creation. This alienation appears in other post-flood texts, humans are described as struggling with knowledge the gods haven't directly taught. The myth of Etana describes post-flood king seeking divine help with human reproduction because people have forgotten how it works. Other texts describe gods teaching agriculture, irrigation, crafts to post-flood humans as if knowledge must be relearned. This suggests the flood destroyed not just population, but cultural continuity. Pre-flood humans knew things post-flood humans had to relearn. The break was absolute. Civilization had to be rebuilt from reduced baseline, and the humans who rebuilt it were biologically modified to prevent them from ever again reaching pre-flood levels of success. They would die younger, they would reproduce less successfully, they would lose children to demons, they would suffer chronic disease, they would endure periodic plagues. All of this was bargain for continued existence. The gods could have ended humanity permanently. Instead, they chose modification. Humanity survived, but only as a diminished version of what it had been. The Atra-Hasis epic ends with this arrangement in place. Humans resume worship and service. Gods receive offerings again. The system restarts, but with safeguards ensuring it won't fail again the same way. Humanity's first mistake, thriving too successfully, had been corrected through permanent redesign of human condition itself. We were made mortal, we were made vulnerable, we were made few, and we were made quiet. The tablets recording this arrangement are not warm or reassuring. They document negotiations between divine powers about how to manage problematic species. Humanity's perspective is largely absent. We are the subject of the discussion, not participants in it. This is the role the texts assign to humanity throughout. We were created to serve. When we served too successfully, we were corrected. When we recovered, we were corrected again. Finally, we were redesigned to stay corrected. The post-flood world documented in these tablets is world where human suffering serves function. Death has purpose. Disease has role. Infertility contributes to cosmic order. None of this exists randomly or as punishment for individual transgression. It exists as systemic population management implemented after humanity demonstrated it could not be trusted to manage itself. This theological framework shaped how Mesopotamian people understood their own lives. When you lost child, when you suffered illness, when you faced premature death, these were not mysterious workings of providence or tests of faith. They were gods maintaining the bargain, keeping humanity within acceptable parameters, ensuring the mistake would not be repeated. Every generation lived under this system. Every generation contributed to the proof that the system worked. Population never again reached pre-flood levels. Cities remained manageable. Noise stayed below threshold. And the gods, presumably satisfied, returned to their rest. But one text raises disturbing question about this arrangement. A fragment from Nippur, badly damaged, part of what scholars call the Sumerian flood story, or Eridu Genesis. The text is so fragmentary that full translation is impossible, but enough survives to reveal something the other texts don't directly address. This fragment describes Ziusudra after the flood, apparently questioning whether the settlement was just. The text is too broken to reconstruct his full argument, but phrases like "why must" and "for whose sake" and "the people who" suggest he was challenging the divine decision. The fragment ends abruptly. Whether Ziusudra's question was answered, whether he was punished for asking, whether the text originally continued, none of this can be determined. The tablet breaks off mid-sentence, but the existence of this fragment reveals that someone, at some point, composed text in which the flood survivor questioned divine authority. Even if that question went unanswered or was punished, its presence in the textual tradition suggests not everyone accepted the arrangement without resistance. Perhaps there was ambiguity, even among the ancient Sumerians themselves, about whether humanity's mistake justified its permanent redesign into suffering condition. Perhaps some remembered that the mistake wasn't moral transgression, but biological success. Perhaps they wondered whether the gods were truly justified in punishing species for doing exactly what it was created to do. The texts don't resolve these questions. They preserve the arrangement, document its terms, record its implementation, but they also preserve fragments of resistance, moments where humans questioned cosmic order even while accepting its authority. These fragments suggest the theology documented in the Atra-Hasis epic was not universally comfortable. It explained reality, but it didn't make reality less harsh. It provided framework for understanding suffering, but it didn't eliminate suffering. And for anyone reading these tablets carefully, one unsettling implication remained. If the gods had corrected humanity once through the flood and once through biological modification, they maintained the capacity to correct humanity again. The system worked only so long as humans stayed within parameters. If population grew too large again, if noise exceeded thresholds again, the gods could deploy additional interventions. The post-flood modifications were not guarantee of safety. They were probationary measures. Humanity existed at divine discretion, tolerated only so long as it remained quiet and small. This anxiety shaped Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years, and the tablets recording that anxiety, pressed into clay and fired hard, survived to bear witness to a theological framework where humanity's greatest mistake was succeeding too well at the task it was created to perform. Eridu Genesis, the fragmentary warning. The tablet sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Near East section, catalogue number CBS 10673. Single clay tablet, damaged at the edges, text worn in places where hands held it millennia ago. The cuneiform is Sumerian, dialect from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1600 BC, though the story it records is far older. Scholars call this text the Eridu Genesis, or the Sumerian flood story. It's the oldest known version of the deluge narrative, predating the Atra-Hasis epic by several centuries, and the biblical Genesis flood by well over a millennium. The text was excavated from Nippur in the early 20th century by archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania, but what survives is fragment. The beginning is lost. The ending is damaged. What remains is approximately 300 lines covering creation, establishment of kingship, 5 antediluvian cities, and the flood. The gaps are significant. They suggest either the original tablet was much longer, or this is one tablet from multi-tablet composition now lost. The fragmentary nature creates interpretive challenges, but it also reveals something important. This story was considered worth preserving despite its incomplete state. Someone copied it. Multiple versions existed, suggesting the story circulated widely. The survival of even damaged versions indicates cultural significance. The text begins abruptly, mid-sentence, the Nidkalak offerings, the pure offerings. This suggests ritual context, possibly description of pre-flood religious practices. Then comes cosmological framework. The gods An, Enlil, Enki and Ninhursag create humanity and establish civilization. The text then lists 5 cities where kingship was exercised before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. These are the same cities mentioned in the Sumerian king list. The text identifies their patron deities and describes their founding as deliberate acts of divine city planning. This part of the text presents pre-flood civilization as organised, divinely sanctioned, functioning properly. Nothing suggests transgression or divine displeasure. The cities exist. Kings rule. Offerings are made. Everything operates as designed. Then comes a damage section. Approximately 37 lines are missing or illegible. When the text resumes, flood is already decided. The tablet states, all the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood swept over the cult centres. No explanation for divine decision is provided in the surviving text. no description of human transgression, no divine complaint, no discussion of noise or overpopulation. The flood simply happens, as if the missing 37 lines contained the crucial justification now lost. This raises disturbing possibility. Perhaps the justification was deliberately omitted. Perhaps later copyists, uncomfortable with the reasoning preserved in older versions, simply skipped that section when creating new copies. The gap might be censorship rather than damage. Alternative explanation is that the missing section described what the Atra-Hasis epic would later document in detail: population growth, noise, divine frustration. The Eridu Genesis might have been original source for that narrative, with later texts like Atra-Hasis expanding and elaborating its themes. But we cannot know. The gap is absolute. What survives is description of Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, receiving divine warning. The text describes him as humble, obedient, reverential. These qualities suggest why he was chosen for survival. But chosen by whom? The tablet is damaged at the crucial moment. A god speaks, but the name is lost. Only the warning survives. A flood will sweep over the cult centres to destroy the seed of mankind. This is the decision, the word of the assembly of the gods. The phrase assembly of the gods indicates collective decision, not individual caprice. The flood was authorised by divine council, formal declaration, institutional judgment. This was policy, not rage. Ziusudra is instructed to build a huge boat. The dimensions are lost to tablet damage. The construction process isn't described. The text simply states he humbly obeyed and reverentially then the tablet is damaged again. When the text resumes, the flood is already in progress. All the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood swept over the cult centres. After, for 7 days and 7 nights, the flood had swept over the land, and the huge boat had been tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters, Utu came forth, who sheds light on heaven and earth. Utu is the sun god. His emergence signals the flood's end. Ziusudra opens the boat's window, light streams in. He prostrates himself before Utu, makes sacrifice. The text describes an ox, a sheep. Then An and Enlil appear. The text states, they gave him life like a god. They brought down eternal breath of life for him, like a god. At that time, for preserving the animals and the seed of mankind, they settled Ziusudra the king in an overseas land, in the land Dilmun, where the sun rises. This matches the pattern from later texts. The flood survivor is granted immortality and removed from human world. Dilmun was understood as paradise, land where death does not exist. Placing Ziusudra there ensured he could not reproduce, could not contribute to post-flood population, could not disturb the divine settlement. But then the text ends, abruptly, mid-theme. The tablet breaks off without describing the post-flood world, the redesign of humanity, the terms of continued existence. Everything the Atra-Hasis epic would later document in detail is simply absent. This absence is significant. The Eridu Genesis, as oldest flood narrative, either didn't know about the post-flood modifications or knew and chose not to record them. Either possibility raises questions. If the modifications weren't yet part of the story, that suggests they were later theological development. Perhaps humanity initially understood the flood as one-time catastrophe, not as trigger for permanent redesign. The harsher implications, infertility, infant mortality, chronic disease as divine policy, might have been added to explain ongoing suffering in later periods. Alternatively, if the Eridu Genesis knew the modifications but didn't record them, that suggests strategic omission. Perhaps these details were too disturbing, too likely to generate resistance. Better to document the flood as extraordinary event, not as beginning of permanent punitive system. We cannot know which interpretation is correct. The text is too damaged, too fragmentary, but its incompleteness is itself revealing. Because the Eridu Genesis was copied despite its damaged state, multiple versions existed. The story circulated through Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years in incomplete form. This suggests the fragment was sufficient. The basic narrative, flood, survivor, divine favour, conveyed necessary information. The details, whether lost to damage or never included, were not essential for the text's function. That function appears to be memorial. The Eridu Genesis preserved memory of catastrophe that divided ages. Before flood, 5 cities, kingship, civilization functioning. After flood, 1 survivor, divine gift, new beginning. The contrast was the message. Everything changed. The world before was lost. The world after was different. But there's one detail in the Eridu Genesis that appears nowhere else. The text describes Ziusudra opening the boat's window and prostrating himself before Utu, the sun god. In later versions, Atra-Hasis, Gilgamesh, the survivor makes sacrifice to the gods in general. They smell the offering and gather like flies. But in the Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra specifically worships Utu, the sun god, the one who brings light after darkness, order after chaos, measurement after formlessness. Utu's presence at the flood's end suggests he played a role in its resolution. This might explain why Ziusudra was granted immortality. Perhaps Utu advocated for him, as Enki advocated for Atra-Hasis in later texts. The assembly of gods authorized the flood, but individual god protected one human, ensuring species survival. This pattern, collective judgment, individual mercy, appears throughout these texts. The divine council decides. One god subverts. Humanity survives, but diminished. The pattern suggests internal divine politics, disagreement about how to handle the human problem. Enlil wanted elimination. Enki wanted preservation. The compromise was reduction with redesign. The flood killed most humans. The survivors were modified to prevent recurrence. Both gods achieved partial victory. But the Eridu Genesis doesn't document this political dynamic. It simply states the flood happened, one human survived, he was granted eternal life. The theological complexity evident in later texts is absent or unrecorded. This raises final question about the fragmentary nature of this tablet. What was in the missing 37 lines before the flood? What was in the sections now damaged beyond recovery? One possibility, the missing text described pre-flood humanity in ways that later tradition found uncomfortable. Perhaps the original version was too explicit about divine capriciousness, too honest about God's self-interested motivations. Later texts refined the narrative, adding justification, building theological framework that made the flood comprehensible as divine justice rather than divine convenience. The Eridu Genesis might preserve older, less refined version, where God simply decided to destroy humanity without elaborate rationale. They were annoyed. They had power. They used it. The survivor was lucky exception, not moral exemplar. This reading finds support in the text's description of Ziusudra. He's called humble, obedient, reverential, but nothing in the surviving text describes specific actions that demonstrated these qualities. Unlike Noah in Genesis, who is righteous in his generation, unlike Atra-Hasis, who is exceedingly wise, Ziusudra is simply humble, passive, obedient. Perhaps that's the point. The original story didn't require moral justification. The gods acted, humans obeyed or died. The one who survived was the one who obeyed divine warning when it came. His qualities mattered less than his proximity to divine favour. This is harsher theology than what later texts developed. It suggests divine human relationships function through power and compliance rather than moral coherence. The gods didn't need reasons to destroy humanity. They had authority. That was sufficient. The fragmentary state of CBS 10673 means we cannot confirm this reading, but the trajectory from Eridu Genesis to Atra-Hasis to biblical Genesis shows clear evolution toward increasing justification of divine action. Later versions add reasoning, moral frameworks, explanations for why the flood was necessary. The earliest version simply states it happened. Perhaps that's what the fragment preserves. Memory of catastrophe before it was narratively justified. Raw recollection of disaster before theology explained it. The flood swept over. Most died. One survived. Civilization restarted. The missing sections might have contained early attempts at explanation, but those attempts, if they existed, were incomplete enough that later traditions felt compelled to elaborate, expand, provide better rationale. Or perhaps the original text contained no explanation because none was needed. The Sumerians who first told this story lived in a world where floods destroyed cities regularly. The Tigris and Euphrates overflowed. Levees failed, settlements were abandoned and rebuilt elsewhere. Catastrophic flooding was experiential reality, not mythological invention. The Eridu Genesis might simply document particularly devastating flood that destroyed multiple cities simultaneously. The 5 cities listed, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, might represent actual settlements lost in single inundation event. The lone survivor's story might preserve memory of refugee who escaped and later claimed divine protection. Over centuries, this memory became theology. The flood became divine judgment. The survivor became divinely chosen. The practical disaster transformed into cosmic drama. But at its core, preserved in fragmentary clay, lay simpler story, water rose, cities drowned, one man lived to tell about it. The Eridu Genesis, in its incompleteness, reminds us that these were not originally systematic theological texts. They were stories told and retold, copied and recopied, gradually elaborated and refined. The damage to CBS 1673 reveals the fragility of this transmission. Knowledge could be lost. Sections could crumble. Later generations had to work with incomplete information, filling gaps through interpretation and elaboration. The result was textual tradition, where earlier and later versions coexisted, each preserving different elements, different emphases, different theological frameworks. The Eridu Genesis was older. The Atra-Hasis was more elaborate. The Gilgamesh incorporated the story within larger heroic narrative. Genesis transformed it into covenant theology, but all versions preserved the core. There was a flood. It was divine action. One human survived. The world that came after was different from the world before. The fragmentary tablet in Philadelphia bears witness to this pattern. Its gaps and damages testify to both preservation and loss. Someone valued this story enough to copy it. Someone else lost sections to time and accident. What survives is partial, incomplete, requiring careful interpretation. But even partial, it tells a central story. Humanity made mistake. The gods responded with catastrophe. One family survived. Civilization began again, diminished. And the question that haunts the fragment's gaps remains: what exactly was humanity's mistake? The missing 37 lines might have told us, but those lines are gone, lost to time, left to later texts to answer differently, to impose frameworks, to build justifications. The silence where explanation should be might itself be the message. The flood swept over. That was sufficient. Understanding why was luxury for survivors who had time to ask. Those who drowned never got to ask at all. Patterns across civilizations, Egypt, India, and the global echo. The Mesopotamian pattern, humanity makes noise, gods send catastrophe, population is reduced, was not unique to Sumer. Similar narratives appear across cultures separated by vast distances and centuries, suggesting either common experience of catastrophic flooding or transmission of mythological framework across civilizational boundaries. The Egyptian version appears in a text called the Book of the Heavenly Cow, preserved on walls in royal tombs from the New Kingdom period, 1550-177 BC, though the story itself is believed to be much older. The narrative describes humanity rebelling against the sun god Ra. The text doesn't specify what form this rebellion took. The Egyptian phrase is simply that men plotted against Ra. But Ra's response suggests the threat was significant. He convened assembly of gods, including his father Nun, the primordial ocean, and his divine eye Hathor. The council's decision was elimination. Ra commanded Hathor, in her form as the fierce goddess Sekhmet, to slaughter humanity. The text describes her descending to earth and beginning systematic massacre. She slaughtered men, and her heart was glad when she did it. This continues for days. Sekhmet wades in human blood, delighting in destruction. The text specifies that she did not stop when the night came, continuous killing, day and night, until humanity approached extinction. Then Ra changed his mind. The text states, "My heart is grieved to have to destroy them." He decided to save remaining humans, but faced problem. Sekhmet was now in blood frenzy, impossible to stop through simple command. So Ra devised stratagem. He ordered large quantities of beer to be brewed and mixed with red ochre to resemble blood. This beer was poured out in fields where Sekhmet would pass. She saw the red liquid, assumed it was blood, and drank deeply. The beer intoxicated her so completely that she fell asleep and forgot her mission of slaughter. When she woke, transformed back into gentle Hathor, humanity was saved. But Ra declared he was exhausted by the experience and would withdraw from direct earthly governance. He ascended to the heavens, creating the sky cow that carries him, and established the current order where gods rule from distance rather than presence. The parallels to Mesopotamian narratives are striking. Humanity does something that angers the gods. Divine council authorizes destruction. Systematic slaughter begins. One god regrets the decision. Clever intervention stops the killing before extinction. Gods withdraw from direct earthly contact. Post-catastrophe world is diminished version of what came before. The differences are also significant. In the Egyptian version, the catastrophe is direct divine violence, not flood. The intervention that stops it is deception rather than preservation of one family. And crucially, the Egyptian text never specifies what humanity did to deserve destruction. The rebellion is mentioned but not described. This vagueness might be strategic. By not defining the transgression, the text makes the story applicable to any future situation where divine-human relationships deteriorate. Whatever humanity does to anger the gods could trigger similar response. The lesson is general: do not provoke divine wrath, because the consequences are catastrophic. But there's one detail that suggests connection to the Mesopotamian noise narrative. The text describes Sekhmet's slaughter continuing day and night without pause. This is specifically noted as disturbing to Ra. The goddess's violence generated continuous disturbance, unrelenting chaos. Ra's solution, stopping Sekhmet through intoxication, restored quiet. The killing stopped. The land fell silent. This suggests the problem Ra was solving wasn't just human rebellion, but the acoustic chaos of continuous slaughter. Peace, in this context, meant the absence of disturbance. And after the catastrophe, Ra withdrew to the heavens. He separated himself from earthly noise. This withdrawal matches the pattern in Sumerian texts, where gods pull back after the flood, maintaining distance from the populations they had reduced. The Egyptian version, then, might preserve variant of the same underlying narrative. Excessive human presence disturbs divine order, gods nearly eliminate humanity, wisdom prevails to limit rather than complete the destruction, divine withdrawal creates new relationship paradigm. Evidence of transmission between Egypt and Mesopotamia exists in diplomatic correspondence, trade records, and shared mythological motifs. The Elamana archive, where some Adapa fragments were found, demonstrates regular communication between Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings during the Late Bronze Age. Stories could have travelled these diplomatic routes, adapted to local theological frameworks, integrated into existing mythologies. Further east, similar patterns appear in Indian traditions. The Vedic flood narrative describes Manu, the first man, receiving warning from a fish that a great flood is coming. The fish instructs Manu to build boat. The flood comes, destroys all other life. Manu survives. After the waters recede, Manu performs sacrifice, from which humanity is regenerated. The core elements match: flood, warning, boat, survival, sacrifice, renewal. but the Vedic version includes detail absent from Mesopotamian accounts. The fish that warns Manu grows progressively larger until it is revealed as Matsya, avatar of the god Vishnu. This divine protector figure serving as avatar matches the role of Enki in Mesopotamian tradition, god who maintains investment in human survival despite divine council's elimination order. The fish form might represent adaptation to Indian religious symbolism, where water-dwelling creatures often signify divine wisdom and protection. Later Indian texts, the Puranas, elaborate this story. The Bhagavata Purana describes humanity being destroyed not for noise, but for moral corruption. This is closer to biblical framework than Mesopotamian pattern. The Matsya Purana specifies the flood lasted 7 days, matching the Mesopotamian time frame. These similarities suggest either independent development from common flood experiences or transmission and adaptation of mythological templates across cultures. The time frames involved: Sumerian texts from 2000 BC, Vedic texts from 1500-1200 BC, Puranic texts from 300-1000 C, show centuries of potential interaction. Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley civilization. Cultural exchange. Mythological frameworks could have travelled with merchants, been adapted by local traditions, integrated into regional religions. But there's another explanation for similarity. All these civilizations experience catastrophic flooding. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt had the Nile. The Indus Valley had its own river systems. Each region knew floods intimately. Each had experienced floods devastating enough to destroy cities, kill populations, force relocations. The mythological response to this experiential reality might have developed independently in each culture using similar narrative structures, because those structures effectively explained traumatic collective experiences. The gods sent the flood, one family survived, civilization restarted. This template worked psychologically, theologically, socially. What makes the Mesopotamian version distinctive is not the flood itself, but the specific attribution of cause. Humanity made noise, disturbed divine rest, was punished through population reduction. This precise explanation appears most clearly in Sumerian and Akkadian sources. Other traditions preserved flood narratives without this specific causation, unless the causation was present but unexpressed. The Egyptian text's vagueness about humanity's rebellion might conceal original understanding that human population density, human acoustic presence, human civilization itself had become intolerable to gods who required quiet. Similarly, the Vedic tradition's emphasis on moral corruption might be later overlay on earlier story where the problem was simply human excess, too many people, too much activity, too much disturbance of cosmic order. Reading these texts as variations on shared theme reveals common pattern. Gods create humans for purpose. Humans fulfill purpose too successfully or differently than intended. Gods respond with near extinction. Surviving humans live in modified relationship with divine powers. This pattern structures divine-human relationships as fundamentally unstable. Humans cannot simply obey and thrive. Our obedience, our success, our very existence creates problems that require divine correction. The only stable state is diminished state, reduced populations, limited lifespans, built-in vulnerabilities that prevent us from becoming too much. The global echo of this pattern in multiple traditions suggests it resonated across cultures because it explained common experiences. Cities did grow loud, populations did strain resources, catastrophic floods did destroy civilizations. The mythological explanation, divine frustration with human excess, provided framework for understanding these realities as purposeful rather than random, and crucially, it provided guidance for avoiding future catastrophe. Stay small, stay quiet, maintain proper relationship with divine powers, don't expand beyond sustainable limits. These were survival strategies encoded in mythology. Whether the stories derived from single source that spread across cultures or developed independently from shared experiences, the result was similar theological framework appearing in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and elsewhere, humanity survives at divine discretion, and that discretion has limits. The civilizations that preserved these stories lasted thousands of years. Perhaps their longevity derived partly from the caution their founding myths instilled. Stay beneath the threshold. Don't trigger divine response. Remember what happened last time humanity forgot its place. The tablets recording these narratives are scattered across museums now. The Atra-Hasis epic in the British Museum, the Eridu Genesis in Philadelphia, Egyptian tomb texts preserved in situ, Vedic texts transmitted orally, then written down centuries later. Each culture preserved its version of the catastrophe. Together they suggest humanity's first mistake was universal, not unique to Sumerians, but pattern recognized across civilizations. We thrive too successfully, we disturb cosmic order, we face correction. The specific form of that correction varied by region. Flood in Mesopotamia, divine slaughter in Egypt, cyclic destruction and renewal in Indian traditions. But the underlying dynamic remained consistent. Divine powers maintain ultimate authority. Human success has limits. Crossing those limits triggers response. And that response, when it comes, is devastating enough to divide history into before and after. Survivors remember. They record. They transmit warnings. They build cultures around the imperative never again. But the question these global echoes raise is disturbing. If multiple civilizations independently develop narratives where humanity's success threatens cosmic order, what does that suggest about the relationship between civilization and sustainability? Perhaps the myths preserve uncomfortable truth. Human populations expanding beyond local carrying capacity do generate problems. Dense urban centres do create social, environmental, acoustic stress. Civilizational complexity does require careful management to avoid collapse. The gods in these narratives might represent natural limits personified. Divine frustration with human noise might encode recognition that unchecked growth generates unsustainable conditions. The flood as divine correction might preserve memory of ecological catastrophe triggered by civilizational overreach. Reading the myths this way transforms them from supernatural doctrine into preserved wisdom about limits. The post-flood modifications, high mortality, limited reproduction, chronic vulnerability, might describe actual conditions civilizations faced after catastrophic collapse. Populations do take generations to recover. Knowledge is lost. Infrastructure must be rebuilt. The survivors live diminished lives compared to pre-catastrophe society. Whether gods literally sent the flood, or whether flood metaphorically represents collapse, triggered by exceeding sustainability thresholds, the practical lesson remains: maintain balance, respect limits, understand that unlimited growth generates correction. Every civilization that preserved these stories had experienced collapse or near collapse. They knew intimately what happens when societies overextend. The mythological framework they developed to explain these experiences emphasized the same principles: restraint, humility, acceptance of limits. These were not arbitrary religious requirements. They were survival strategies encoded in sacred narratives, transmitted across generations, reinforced through ritual and culture. The societies that internalized these lessons persisted. Those that ignored them collapsed. The texts surviving in museums today bear witness to this pattern. They were copied and recopied because they conveyed essential information. Humanity had made mistake. The consequences were catastrophic. Future generations must not repeat it. The global distribution of similar narratives suggests the lesson was important enough that multiple cultures developed their own versions. Different languages, different gods, different specific details, but the same core message: humanity must not exceed its place in cosmic order, because the correction that follows excess threatens our continued existence. The tablets don't resolve the theological questions these narratives raise. They don't explain why gods would create beings designed to succeed. then punish them for succeeding. They don't justify the suffering built into post-catastrophe human condition, but they document that these questions were ancient. Humans have wondered for 4,000 years or more why we must be mortal, why we suffer disease and loss, why population growth seems to trigger correction through disaster. The Mesopotamian answer, preserved across tablets now scattered in museums, was simple and harsh: we made too much noise. The gods responded: we were redesigned to stay quiet. Other cultures preserved variations, but the pattern held, and anyone reading these texts carefully, following their thread across civilizations, encounters the same disturbing implication: humanity's greatest mistake was succeeding too well at being human. What the Proverbs remembered. Scattered across multiple tablets, from Nippur, from Ur, from cities whose names we remember only because they wrote them in clay, are collections of Sumerian proverbs, brief statements, folk wisdom, everyday advice. None of these proverbs explicitly mention the flood or divine judgment, but reading context of the larger mythological framework, they reveal how deeply the lesson of restraint penetrated ordinary culture. The proverbs don't preach, they observe, they describe consequences, and repeatedly they warn against the exact behaviours that the creation and flood narratives identified as problematic: noise, boasting, expansion, excess. You should not boast, then your words will be trusted. This appears in multiple proverb collections, simple advice on social reliability. But the verb translated boast is the same root used in flood narratives to describe excessive noise. To boast is to make yourself verbally prominent, to disturb quiet, to draw attention. The proverb doesn't explain why boasting undermines trust. It simply states the correlation: loud self-promotion generates suspicion. Quiet reliability generates confidence. The lesson is practical, but it reinforces broader cultural pattern: less is more, quiet is better, restraint generates positive outcomes. A chattering scribe's guilt is great. Scribes were privileged class in Sumerian society. They controlled literacy, maintained records, transmitted knowledge, but even scribes required restraint. Excessive speech, even from educated elite, was presented as guilt-generating. The proverb doesn't specify guilt before whom, humans or gods, but the weight of the term suggests serious transgression. Upon escaping from the wild ox, the wild cow confronted me. This proverb, preserved in collections from Ashurbanipal's library, describes inescapable danger, modern equivalent: out of the frying pan, into the fire. But the imagery is specific to Mesopotamian environment, and the structure suggests pattern recognition. Threats come in sequence. Escaping one doesn't guarantee safety from the next. Applied to the flood narratives, humanity escaped plague, then drought, then famine, only to face deluge. The pattern of escalating divine interventions made this proverb particularly resonant. No escape exists when divine will targets you. One does not return borrowed bread, debt proverb on its surface, but also statement about irreversible transactions. What is given cannot be reclaimed. What is destroyed cannot be undone. The flood swept over. The pre-flood world was gone. No returning to what was. No one walks for a second time at the place where a lion has eaten a man. Danger sites are avoided. Catastrophes mark locations permanently. After the flood, post-catastrophe humanity avoided pre-flood patterns. Don't rebuild the same way. Don't repeat what triggered disaster. Civilizational trauma creates permanent behavioural modification. The proverbs about restraint in conflict are particularly revealing. If you have brought a dispute, you have carried it. If you have asked to be dismissed from it, you have been rejected. Once conflict begins, you cannot escape responsibility for it. You initiated, you carry consequences. This structure mirrors divine human relationships in flood narratives. Humanity initiated noise. Gods responded. Humanity couldn't escape consequences through pleading. A vicious donkey hangs its neck, however. A vicious man, my son. The proverb breaks off without completing the parallel. The donkey shows submission. The man what? The text doesn't say. suggesting the outcome for vicious men was too well known to require stating. Punishment, correction, elimination. Several proverbs deal specifically with voice and speech control. Tell a lie and then tell the truth, it will be considered a lie. Reputation shapes interpretation. Previous behaviour determines credibility. This might seem obvious, but in context of civilization that believed their ancestors' noise triggered catastrophe, it takes on added meaning. Humanity established reputation through pre-flood excess. Post-flood promises of restraint would be viewed suspiciously. The gods had reason to distrust. Only sustained demonstration of quiet compliance could rebuild credibility. The negligent one ruins his family. Negligence wasn't just personal failure, it threatened the collective unit that depended on individual responsibility. In post-flood framework, where population control was divine policy, every family's survival depended on avoiding behaviours that might trigger intervention. One negligent person could doom an entire household. You should not work using only your eyes. You will not multiply your possessions using only your mouth. Action produces results, not observation or speech. But notice the verb, multiply, the same term used in creation narratives to describe population growth. The proverb subtly warns against multiplying through passive means. Work is required. Effort is necessary. Growth doesn't happen through wishful speech. This connects to the noise problem. Words don't build civilization, labour does. But excess words, boastful speech, loud claims without corresponding action, these generate the acoustic disturbance without productive result. Better to work silently than speak loudly. The strong one can escape from anyone's hand, except divine hands. The proverb celebrates strength, but doesn't specify its limits. The flood narratives provided those limits. No human strength escapes divine judgment. Even the strongest cities, the most fortified walls, the most numerous populations, all drowned when the gods decided. Fate is a wet bank, it can make one slip. Fate is unstable foundation. What seems secure can suddenly give way. This describes lived experience in Mesopotamia, where riverbanks collapsed, where floods changed courses, where solid ground became treacherous water without warning. But it also captures theological uncertainty. Divine favour is not permanent. What the gods grant, they can revoke. The instructions of Shurupak, which we examined earlier, functioned as extended proverb collection, but shorter proverb traditions preserve similar wisdom in condensed form. These brief statements circulated orally, were memorized, shaped daily decisions. For the shepherd, he stopped searching, he stopped bringing back the sheep. Abandonment proverb. The shepherd gives up his duty. But why? The text doesn't explain. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps futility, perhaps recognition that some things cannot be recovered once lost. Applied to post-flood humanity, the gods stopped searching for pre-flood civilization. They stopped trying to bring it back. They accepted its loss and rebuilt differently. Some things, once destroyed, should remain destroyed. Nothing at all is to be valued, but life should be sweet. This appears in the instructions of Shurupak, but was preserved independently as standalone proverb. It suggests priority structure, possessions don't matter, experience does. Life's sweetness, its quality, not duration, is what deserves valuing. In context of mortality as divine design, this proverb takes on particular weight. Life will be short. Death is guaranteed. The only variable is whether brief existence is sweet or bitter. Choose sweetness where possible. Accept that nothing material outlasts death. A loving heart maintains a family. A hateful heart destroys a family. Internal dynamics determine survival. External circumstances matter less than internal cohesion. This was survival wisdom for post-catastrophe populations. Cities could be destroyed, populations could be reduced, but family units that maintained internal harmony could endure. The proverbs about water and drowning carry obvious weight. You should not draw up water which you cannot reach. It will make you weak. Don't overextend. Don't attempt beyond your capacity. The water metaphor is precise in culture, where flood was both literal threat and mythological memory. Reaching for water you cannot grasp makes you vulnerable to drowning. And perhaps most directly relevant to humanity's mistake, the land was bellowing like a bull. This line appears in both Atra-Hasis epic and in proverb collections, suggesting it functioned as cultural shorthand. Everyone knew what it meant: excessive noise, population density beyond acceptable limits, the condition that triggered divine response. When someone said the land bellows like a bull, they weren't just describing loudness, they were invoking the flood narrative, warning that current conditions resembled pre-catastrophe patterns, suggesting divine intervention might follow if restraint wasn't exercised. These proverbs functioned as distributed wisdom system, not centralized religious doctrine, but everyday common sense that preserved and transmitted the lessons of catastrophe across generations. Parents taught children, scribes copied tablets. The sayings shaped behaviour at ground level where formal theology might not penetrate. The genius of proverb wisdom is its practical format. You don't need to understand complex theology to grasp you should not boast, then your words will be trusted. You don't need to know the Atra-Hasis epic to benefit from fate is a wet bank, it can make one slip. But for those who did know the larger narratives, the proverbs connected to deeper framework. They were practical applications of theological principles. They translated cosmic drama into daily guidance. Don't make noise, don't multiply excessively, don't draw divine attention, don't repeat the patterns that triggered catastrophe. Stay small, stay quiet, accept mortality, value what sweetness brief life offers. This was collective wisdom preserved across 4,000 years of transmission. The tablets scattered in museums contain fragments of this wisdom. University collections hold thousands of proverb tablets, many still untranslated, many damaged, many fragmentary, but enough survives to reveal the pattern. Mesopotamian culture was shaped by memory of catastrophe and determination to avoid repeating it. The proverbs were one mechanism of that shaping. Brief, memorable, practical statements that kept the lesson alive without requiring elaborate theological education. And the lesson was always the same. Humanity's first mistake was exceeding our place. We were created to serve. We served too well. We became too numerous, too loud, too successful. The gods corrected us. We must never forget that correction, never repeat the behaviours that triggered it. The proverbs remembered. They kept the memory active in daily life, in ordinary decisions, in the accumulated small choices that determine whether civilizations persist or collapse. You should not boast. Stay quiet. The negligent one ruins his family. Stay vigilant. Fate is a wet bank. Stay humble. Nothing is to be valued, but life should be sweet. Stay grateful for brief existence. These weren't random moral platitudes. They were survival instructions, tested across centuries, proven effective by the persistence of civilizations that followed them. The societies that internalized these proverbs lasted thousands of years. Their tablets survived. Their wisdom remains accessible. And anyone reading those tablets today encounters the same advice. Know your limits, respect boundaries, understand that success can become danger if it crosses thresholds, maintain restraint, because the alternative is correction. The gods, according to these texts, destroyed the world once. They maintained capacity to do it again. The only protection was compliance encoded in culture, transmitted through proverbs, reinforced through daily practice. Humanity's first mistake was biological success. The proverbs taught cultural restraint to counterbalance biological capacity. Together, these form survival strategy, stay numerous enough to sustain civilization, but never so numerous you disturb cosmic order. The balance was delicate. The margin was thin, but the proverbs suggested it was achievable. Generations had achieved it. The proof was their survival, their continued existence, their ability to write these proverbs and preserve them for future generations. And the final proverb, unstated but implicit in every collection, remember the flood. Remember what happens when humanity forgets its place. Remember that the gods are watching, that divine patience has limits, that existence continues only at divine discretion. The tablets bearing these proverbs are small, often palm-sized, easily portable. Students carried them, scribes referenced them, families taught them. The wisdom circulated because it was useful, because it worked, because it kept people alive in a world where divine judgment remained a perpetual threat. 4,000 years later, the proverbs remain. The tablets survive. The wisdom waits in museum archives and university collections, preserved in wedge marks pressed into clay, fired hard enough to outlast the civilizations that created them. And the question they pose to anyone reading them is simple. If these civilizations believed their survival depended on staying small and quiet, what does that suggest about civilizations that pursue unlimited growth and accept noise as inevitable feature of progress? The proverbs don't answer, they simply observe, preserve, transmit. The lesson is there for anyone willing to read cuneiform and contemplate what ancient wisdom might still apply. Humanity made noise. The gods responded. We were corrected. The proverbs remember. Whether modern civilization remembers is a different question entirely. The question that remains in the clay. The tablet feels cold. Not metaphorically, but literally cold, the way clay fired 4,000 years ago stays cool even in climate-controlled museum storage. BM 78941 sits where we began, in the British Museum's archives, its cuneiform script as clear as the day the scribe pressed wedges into wet earth and set it to dry in Mesopotamian sun. The tablet documents what the gods decided: humanity disturbed their rest, so humanity was reduced. The noise problem was solved through population control, through biological modification, through built-in limitations ensuring we would never again reach pre-flood numbers. This was presented as policy decision, divine administration, cosmic maintenance. The texts record it with bureaucratic precision, complaints received, solutions attempted, final intervention implemented, redesign parameters established. The tone is almost clinical, but beneath that clinical precision lies question that the tablets record without fully answering. A question that appears in fragments, in gaps, in moments where the texts acknowledge discomfort without resolving it. Was this just? The question surfaces in unexpected places. In the lament of Nintu, the mother goddess who wept at the destruction of her creations. In the fragment from the Eridu Genesis, where Ziusudra seems to question divine decision. In the instructions of Shurupak, where a father teaches his son how to survive in a world where divine patience has limits that humans didn't choose and couldn't predict. Humanity's first mistake, according to these texts, was succeeding at the task we were created to perform. We were made to work. We worked. We multiplied. We built cities. We developed civilization, and in doing so we made noise. We disturbed divine rest. The gods responded by killing nearly everyone and redesigning survivors to ensure biological success would never again threaten divine comfort. This is not moral failure being punished. This is functional success being corrected. We didn't disobey. We didn't rebel. We didn't steal forbidden knowledge or challenge divine authority. We simply thrived. And for thriving, we were reduced to permanent state of vulnerability, short lives, high infant mortality, chronic disease, limited reproduction. These weren't temporary punishments. They were permanent redesign features, built into human condition to serve divine preference for quiet. The tablets document this without extensive justification. The gods were disturbed. The gods had power. The gods used that power. The moral framework came later, in interpretive layers, in theological elaboration, in attempts to make the catastrophe comprehensible as justice rather than as exercise of raw authority. But the Sumerian texts, particularly the earliest ones, don't provide that comfort. They document what happened with remarkable honesty. Humanity became inconvenient, so humanity was corrected. The convenience of gods took precedence over the survival of humans. This was cosmic order. 4 millennia later, sitting in museum archives, these tablets still bear witness to that framework. The cuneiform hasn't changed. The message hasn't softened. The texts still say, you were created to serve, you served too successfully, you were punished for that success, you continue existing only under modified terms that ensure you will never again disturb those you serve. This is not mythology in the sense of comfortable stories that explain and justify. This is documentation of power dynamics between creators and created, between immortal beings who require service and mortal beings whose very success at providing that service triggered near extinction. The question remains in the clay. If humanity's mistake was succeeding too well at our designed function, what does that reveal about the gods who designed us? If multiplication and noise were inevitable results of intelligence and labour capacity, why didn't the gods foresee that problem? If the solution was permanent biological limitations ensuring human suffering, why should humans accept that suffering as just? The texts don't resolve these questions, they preserve them. They document that even in ancient Sumer, people wondered whether divine decisions were truly just, whether cosmic order genuinely served good purpose, whether humanity deserved the condition imposed upon it. The fragmentary nature of some texts, the missing 37 lines in the Eridu Genesis, the damaged sections in the Atra-Hasis, the broken ending of the Shuruppak instructions, these gaps might preserve traces of questions too dangerous to fully record, too uncomfortable to completely preserve. Or perhaps the questions weren't dangerous at all. Perhaps they were simply unanswerable, acknowledged without being resolved, transmitted as permanent features of human condition alongside mortality and disease. We live briefly, we suffer often, we lose children, we die. And according to these tablets, we live this way because our ancestors made too much noise. The tablets sit in museums, the question sits in the clay, and anyone who encounters these texts must decide what to make of them. Ancient error, valuable history, preserved wisdom, or uncomfortable truth about power and survival that still applies. The cuneiform remains clear, the translation remains accurate, the message remains disturbing. Humanity's first mistake, according to the oldest written records of civilization, was being too successfully human, and the price we still pay, the mortality and vulnerability and suffering built into existence, traces back to that original success and the divine response it triggered. The tablets don't offer comfort, they offer memory, not of gods who loved us, but of gods who needed us and who corrected us when need became complicated by noise. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps memory, preserved across 4,000 years in wedge marks pressed into clay, serves its purpose simply by surviving. These stories shaped civilizations. These warnings prevented repetition. These texts, uncomfortable as they are, kept humanity aware of limits and conscious of the cost of exceeding them. The flood did not return. Post-flood civilizations persisted. The lesson, apparently, was learned. Whether that lesson remains relevant, whether modern civilization remembers the caution these ancient texts preserved, whether humanity still believes in limits or has decided limits no longer apply, these questions lie outside the scope of cuneiform tablets. But the tablets remain. The story survives. The question sits preserved in clay, waiting in museum archives, available to anyone willing to learn ancient script and consider what humanity's oldest written records suggest about humanity's deepest mistake. We thrived, we multiplied, we made the world loud with living, and for that we were nearly erased. The gods granted mercy, but only after reducing us to condition, ensuring we would never disturb them again. The tablets record it all, the clay remembers, the question remains. Perhaps it's time to rest with it.